Some of the sweetest words I have heard in my adult life were spoken by Wayne Daniel when he unexpectedly asked to speak at his wife Shirley's memorial. You'll have to wait to meet Wayne and Shirley in heaven. They don't live in Tomball. Married on November 6, 1955, in Macon, Missouri, Wayne and Shirley set out a life together. They loved Jesus, they loved one another, and God entrusted to them 3 beautiful kids. And they lived life. But at the age of 49, their oldest daughter, Sherry, passed away. And then at the age of 45, their middle son, Ron, passed away. And then in her late 30s, their granddaughter, Melissa, passed away. And this couple endured such great loss. They remained faithful to the Lord and to one another for 63 years. And Wayne, being an introvert, and feeling that he would be too overwhelmed to speak, and all the planning leading up to the memorial service, he said, I won't be able to do that. So what do you do when you're leading a memorial service and a husband of 63 years all of a sudden stands up and asks to speak? You give him the floor. You give him the floor. And what came next, I was not ready for. He took a microphone. He stood next to the table that had her remains and a picture. And he just talks to her. He said, "Shirley, you always told me you hoped we would grow old together. Well, we grew old together. But sweetheart, you never grew old to me." I mean, he should have just dropped the mic. What a line. We grew old together, but sweetheart, you never grew old to me. 63 years of endurance, of steadfast love. That is loyal love embodied, isn't it? Oh my goodness. Genuinely one of the sweetest moments of my adult life, certainly in ministry. That is what the book of Ruth is for God's people, having come through the series of the book of Judges. The book of Judges has been difficult, has it not? Very challenging, as we have seen this downward spiral where sinful compromise brought only failure for God's people. That has been, I think, the warning for us from the book of Judges, is that sinful compromise spirals into failure. It's true of leaders, it's true of God's people. And this journey through the book of Judges, as we've done an exposition of this book, has really given a bleak picture of what the end result can be, even for God's people, when our trust is no longer placed in God, and when we have replaced the worship of God alone with other idols, and we've turned our trust into people or into ourselves. It leads us into sinful compromise, which brings failure. That's the warning. And we ended the book last week, and really in just some of the most heinous actions, atrocities done against women, and civil war that broke out between God's people. And we began our series in the book of Joshua. Do you remember that? at the end of Joshua, this covenant moment for God's people where they promise to serve the Lord and to be faithful to Him. And then as soon as we enter into the pages of Judges, we don't even end chapter 1 and things have gone badly. And then it has just been this spiral to where the people of God look nothing different than the pagan world they were supposed to overturn. Yet, tucked in the midst of this era, God has provided another book called the Book of Ruth. And the Book of Ruth speaks to hope. Hope in the spiral. We don't know exactly where Ruth slots in the timeline of history in the Judges. We can't be very dogmatic as about when, maybe in the time of Gideon, we're not sure. But in the midst of a warning to God's people from the book of Judges is a promise to God's people that God's loyal love is our hope in the spiral. At His loyal love, His steadfast love, His loving kindness, even in a time of sinful compromise, remains the hope for God's people in the spiral. We're going to look at the book of Ruth as we close out our series on Judges. We have been spiral bound, and we close with our theme of hope in the spiral. I hope you will look at the book of Ruth with new eyes, knowing the backdrop now in which this book is framed. If you look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 with me, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So if you're a reader of God's word and you're from the people of God and you're hearing this scroll read out loud, and it were a melodrama, in the days when the judges ruled, your response would be, oh no. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. You go, oh no. And a man of Bethlehem and Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. And this should be a clue, a textual clue to really go, oh no. Because in Judges 17, there was a Levite who left Bethlehem to sojourn and things went badly. You come to Judges 19 and a Levite comes to Bethlehem, takes his concubine, leaves Bethlehem to sojourn elsewhere, and things go badly. And so it's no accident that the narrator of Scripture is bringing you into this story in a very specific way. In the time of the judges, in a time of famine, a man of Bethlehem took his family and left Bethlehem to sojourn. And you are teed up for a tragedy. Do you feel that? Do you see that? You can trace from Judges 17 to Judges 19 to Ruth 1. Doesn't bode well when someone is in the Bethlehem area and they decide, hey, let's take a trip. Especially at this time frame. Well, we continue reading. They left during this time of famine. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And it leaves you, the reader, going, oh, no. But it would also, as the reader, you would kind of go, well, this tracks with what we know about Judges, does it not? Like, Judges is full of dark turns and twists. Like, well, this is just feels like an appendix of Judges rather than a separate book. It's kind of like if things weren't already bad enough in Judges, here let's just pour salt in the wound. And so we are left with these desperate conditions, especially for this woman, Naomi. Naomi was too old to have children. Her husband died. Her 2 sons had taken wives for themselves, foreign wives, which they were not supposed to do, were they? Were the people of God to intermarry at that time with people from outside the tribes? No, they weren't. So they have taken foreign wives for themselves, and now her sons are gone. Husband's dead, sons are dead. She has no hope in her situation. And so she tells her daughters-in-law it would be better for them to remain in their country of Moab, find husbands of their own, and she would go on her own back to Bethlehem and basically die. That was her plan. I will go back. I left full, and I'm going to go back empty. In fact, I'm going to have my name changed from Naomi to Mara, because Mara means bitter. She was so desperate in her circumstances that she could only see herself and think of herself by the bitterness that had marked her life. And then something unexpected happens. One of her daughters-in-law doesn't return to Moab. In fact, she says, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Let no one keep me from being with you. And Ruth makes this covenant binding agreement with Naomi to stay with her. Naomi doesn't feel like that's a wise thing to do, but at the end of the day, Ruth won out and they returned to Bethlehem. And all that a widow could do at that time would be to go to a grain field and see if there could be some pickings among the sheaves to gather just enough to have food for that day. And so she happens upon a field, and as the story progresses, she comes to the field of a man named Boaz. So perhaps this is what Boaz and Ruth looked like at that interaction. Ruth wearing widow's clothes. She begins to work and she catches the attention of Boaz. She caught his attention because the word had gotten around in this community of Bethlehem that a foreigner had come back with Naomi, whom they knew. They knew that Naomi left with a husband and sons and came back without husband and sons, but did come back with a daughter-in-law. And it stood out to the people that Ruth had made such a commitment, that she chose to be with an embittered older widow than to go and seek her own restoration and future in her own country. And so we have this interaction with Booth. If only that was the name of their son. Join me in verse 17 of chapter 2. Verse 17 of chapter 2. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "This man's name with whom I work today is Booth." Boaz. So Ruth was noticed by Boaz. She was given special permission to glean where a widow did not necessarily have an opportunity to glean. She could go right behind the workers. Beyond that, she was invited to actually have a meal that day with Boaz and his other workers. It was this incredible provision, and about 22 liters of grain were gleaned in one single day. It was an object lesson for Naomi, who saw the results of her labor, of Ruth's labor that day, and she couldn't believe the outcome. And when Ruth recounted what had happened over the course of the day, Naomi could only give praise and glory to God for what he had done. So when we began this story of going through the narrative of Ruth, and it sounded like such desperate circumstances that would track with a background of a story set in the time of the Judges, these unexpected glimpses of hope are being dropped in. A foreigner commits to a widow without a future. She's noticed for being a worthy woman, and a man chooses to give her more than what she ought to have, invites her to eat with him, blesses her with overabundance. This should shock our senses. And what this points to is that this is the hesed of God. Hesed is a Hebrew word which means loyal love. It is the theme of the book of Ruth. It's the theme of the entire book. The word is found in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. This is steadfast love or loving kindness. This is love that is attached to a binding agreement. Like a marriage license, right? One hopefully that could stand the test of time for 63 years or longer. And God's loyal love is on display through the heart of Ruth for her mother-in-law, and now through the integrity and the character of a righteous man toward a foreigner, a stranger. What we're seeing is the loyal love of God on display. And this section of Ruth really does speak to this promise that there is hope in the spiral because of God's loyal love is our hope in the present. God's loyal love is our hope in the present. His loyal love is our hope in the spiral, and within the spiral, there's today. And this is a good word for us. This is a great word on a week of Thanksgiving. I mean, how many of you would say that your circumstances are not ideal today? I have a word from God that's sweet to the soul. That God's loyal love is your hope today. He has made a binding agreement with himself. Could you imagine if he put the stipulations on us? I'll make a binding agreement with you, Hinkle, as long as you keep your nose clean and you are faithful, I'm going to give you my love. That would be a really rotten deal for me. But that's not what God has done. He has made a binding agreement with himself. The conditions of the covenant of God's love for his people, it's on him. And this shines like a bright light in the midst of dark pages in Judges, that even in the midst of this downward spiral, the loyal love of God remains. It remains in your situation today, just as it remained in this situation for two widows without much to live for or to live on. And the loyal love of God broke through, and they had hope in the present. Now, this is going to trigger the center point of the book. The book of Ruth is, I've talked with you about the structure of a chiasm where there's parallels that go through a book that bring it to a center point, and that many of the narratives in the Old Testament are constructed that way to help us remember the key lessons. Well, the center point for the book of Ruth is chapter 3, really verses 1 through 8. I want to read verses 1 through 5 in chapter 3 with you. It says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do.' And Ruth replied, 'All that you say, I will do.'" So Naomi recognizes that not only is Boaz a man of great integrity and character, but he's actually in her extended family, or he's a relative of her husband, and is a potential redeemer for Ruth. And you can notice that her language, she's not holding out much hope for herself. Naomi isn't. She's holding out hope for her daughter-in-law. She's saying, "I think there could be hope for you." Here's what you're going to do. It's time to take off the widow's cloak. It's time to freshen up. Make yourself presentable as a young lady. And then she hatches this plan to have her go to the threshing floor, which when it was in harvest time, they would work all through the night. They would be eating. They would relax with a cool beverage. Boaz would be in good spirits. And then she asks Ruth to go and find him where he's laying down and that she would uncover his feet. And what in the world is that about? It's actually a gesture of proposal. It's a symbolic gesture to say, "Can I come under your cover? I see your feet. Will you take me under your covering?" It was a vulnerable position. During the time of the judges. Do not forget, church, the backdrop in which this is set. At night, in a field, for a widow, during the time of the judges, with a man who might be a little bit under the influence, is this a good moment? This is a risk. But we've seen this man's character. We've seen his generosity. We've seen his integrity. And so Ruth goes. This is what that scene looked like. Probably not, but let's look at the Bible. Verse 6 through 8 says, "So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, 'Who are you?' And she answered, 'I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer.' And he said, 'May you be blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, this last hesed greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I'm a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. This is a beautiful scene at the threshing floor. She makes her proposal to him, and he receives it. There's a bit of a plot twist if you caught it. He acknowledges, yes, I am in a position to redeem you and to give an actual inheritance and line by bearing a child with you. But there's another family member who has first right of refusal. And so as the reader, you're like, oh, no. It holds you in tension about what's going to happen. He's got to go to the city gates. He's got to present his case to this closer relative. And the closer relative will go, well, Elimelech has a field, pretty good property. I can expand my own territory. I'll pay the price and get more field. And so Boaz is shrewd. And so he's like, hey, I just want you to know that the property for Elimelech is available to be redeemed within our family. You have first right of refusal. You should take it. I'll take it, he says. Boaz goes, by the way, you get one embittered widow in the deal, and you get a foreigner from Moab whom nobody knows anything about. And the guy says, that's too much. That's too much. Actually, his decline is based on most likely he did not want to split his own inheritance with another heir, because it would have been required of him to produce another heir with the young woman. And he thought, no, that's too high a price for me. Interestingly enough, he's the only person in the story to not be named. In fact, in the Hebrew language, he's called an idiom of that so-and-so. Or what's his name? The narrator is letting you know that even in the lack of name, that this was not a man who was like Boaz. His name was Booth. So Boaz is able to secure the field along with Naomi and Ruth. And then in verse 11 of chapter 4, it says, all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So the people see what has happened. They speak this word of blessing and they attach it to previous generations. And they're like, may the Lord establish a line of blessing through how you have sacrificially loved this woman. May you act worthily, Boaz. And may the Lord establish you just as he has established our ancestors. So, verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, blessed be the Yahweh, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. So the narration jumps forward from the marriage to conception to birth. And it's very, very interesting that the story opens with Naomi's desperate, unsolvable problems, to where Naomi and not Ruth, the townspeople call out, Naomi, you have a hope and a future. She had no hope to certain hope. This is the hope in the spiral. And then something really interesting happens. If you know the book of Genesis, there are these structural markers that is called, in the Hebrew language, is called the toledot, in the generations of. And it marks different sections of the book of Genesis as you go through it. So when you come to the book of Ruth, look at this. Now these are the generations. This is a toledot. It may not mean anything to you, but for Bible nerds, that's like, whoa! Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Out of the book of Ruth, we see the loyal love of God preserving his people, blessing his people, and through one couple's faithfulness to the Lord, he will bring their future king. It's very interesting. At the end of Judges, the last tribe to just get things horribly wrong are the men of Gibeah from the tribe of Benjamin. And yet Israel's first king is going to be Saul of the tribe of Benjamin from the city of Gibeah. And then at the book of Ruth, at the end, you have the generations unfolding. And comes the establishment of the line of the intended king that God would have for his people, David. In the Old Testament, what a beautiful story of God's hope that's tied to his loyal love in the spiral of chaos. The sinful rebellion that only brought moral and spiritual and national failure. In the midst of all of that, there's hope. And then you come to the book of Matthew, chapter 1. And this is how the Gospel of Matthew opens about our Savior, Jesus Christ. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of, and this sounds like Ruth, Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez came Hezron, and Hezron and Ram, and Aminadab, and Nahshon, and Salmon, and Boaz, and from Boaz came Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And we find that God's intended purposes, even at the nation's darkest time, was to preserve his covenant love and promise that would one day bring the Messiah. You see, God's loyal love for us is not just only hope in our situation, but it's hope for our future. There was a hope being established through the actions of one man and one woman that they could not see what God would do with their faithfulness. They had no idea. They discovered God's daily provision through food, then provision of a family line through a child. And if I do my math correctly, from Ruth came Obed, from Obed came Jesse, from Jesse came David. Jesse dad, Obed grandpa, Ruth great-grandma. How many great-grandmas are in the room right now? Raise your hand if you are a great-grandma. Does your faithfulness matter? Are you to act worthily, great-grandma? We have no idea the impact the generational impact of what God will do with faithfulness. So God's loyal love is our hope, not just in our situation, but in our future. In our future. God's loyal love is our hope in the spiral. So I just want to ask the question, what does this hope mean for us? What does this hope mean for us? Because we have the benefit of the entire New Testament. And we know that our hope is not in ourselves, and that the covenant plan of God has been fulfilled in Christ. So for us today, Christ is our present and future Redeemer. He is our present and future hope. You knew that when you came in. We held him high. Glorious Jesus Christ. He's our Redeemer, and he is our future. I came across this quote that just stunned me a little bit. It's on a podcast. It was a transcript from a podcast through Lineage, which is a good Bible and theology site. A guy named Barry Cooper said this, "And Christ went to the cross because of his hesed, his loyalty to his people, his kindness and mercy toward them was so unshakable that he endured the very worst that we could devise for him so that we could be clothed in his perfect hesed faithfulness and be credited with it as if we have lived out his perfect life of hesed ourselves." I found that quote remarkable because it's this reminder that Jesus is the one who demonstrated ultimate, perfect, loyal love. And yet, he extends that status and that place of righteousness to all who believe in him. We enter in before God, we've obtained access, but we can only come into God's presence if we are pure and holy in his sight. Is that you? Is that me? Not without Jesus, it's not. But in him, and because of him, we are clothed in his righteousness. We are covered by his holiness. We're marked by his loyal love. So that when the Lord looks at us, he sees a picture of loyal love. We don't earn it, we don't deserve it, yet it is ours in Jesus. So the outcome for today, the challenge for us today is this: bind yourselves to loyal love. Give yourself to sacrificial love, not wait and see, quid pro quo love. That is the love of the world, is it not? You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Remember, Jephthah tried that. Tried to wheel and deal and make deals with God and make a vow before God that ended up costing him the life of his daughter. That's not how we relate to God, and it is certainly not how we should be relating to each other. Bind yourselves to loyal love, especially for the spiral bound. Do you know what I mean by those who are the spiral bound? These are the people who are outside of God's kingdom. These are the people that are caught in the trappings of the world, where they are believing that the good life is by either their own effort or by some other religious system. These are the people that need the loyal love of God and of Christ demonstrated the most. We have an opportunity to bring to them the sweetest sound they could ever hear. That even in the midst of your sin, Christ gave himself for you. Even in the midst of your spiral, God has loved you and sent his Son for you. Those are the sweetest words anyone could ever hear. So, church, let us bind ourselves to the love of God and to demonstrate that love. You have a great practice ground this week. It's Thanksgiving. You got maybe perhaps some challenging people to love. You have an opportunity to go and serve in the name of Christ to our neighbors on Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock. We gather for prayer at 10:30 at the depot, and then to go over to Midtown Apartments, deliver meals. People are expecting. They know these meals are coming. We have the opportunity to meet them, know them, pray with them, bring the message of Christ that might be the sweetest sound they've ever heard. Bind yourself to love, especially those who are spiral bound.